And just a note to our attendees, feel free to use the chat function and the Q&A feature. We will absolutely address your questions throughout the lecture.
I'm Melinda Ann Farrell, the Executive Director of Center for the Arts Eagle Rock. We have been honored to provide multidisciplinary arts programming in the Northeast Los Angeles community and beyond since 1998. I am delighted to welcome you to World on Fire, Flora, Fauna, and Habitats, our virtual panel discussion on the effects of fire and climate change locally and globally. The panel is one of a series of events around our World on Fire exhibition featuring artists from LA printmaking and special guests creating work in response to climate issues and its impact on communities. And I'd like to give a shout out to the juror of our exhibition, Fumalele Shabalala, who is in South Africa right now. So hello, Fumi, and thank you for everything that you did for the show. Center for the Arts Eagle Rock acknowledges our presence on the ancestral territory of the Gabrielino, Tongva, and Kizh peoples, the original caretakers of the land Tovangyar, comprising the Los Angeles Basin, Southern Channel Islands, and beyond. Today, Gabrielino, Tongva, and Kizh people continue to live on and care for this land, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to reside and create within this territory. It is their stewardship of this land that makes this possible. I'd like to thank Pasadena Art Alliance for their generous grant so that we could do the exhibition World on Fire. I want to thank the California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, for making this panel possible. And of course, to the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs for your ongoing support of our organization, our programming, and the community. Now, I'm happy to introduce you to an artist we admire greatly, whose series on wildfires actually was the inspiration for the World on Fire exhibition, Linda Lyke. Linda is a professor of art at Occidental College, and she will introduce her colleagues who are from the biology department of Oxy at the beginning of their presentations, and then our experts will come together for a dialogue followed by your questions. We have a long history of collaboration with Oxy, and we are thrilled that it's continuing with this panel. So on behalf of our team, our board, and our beloved community, thank you so much for your interest in this panel. I hope you enjoy it greatly. And Linda, I will pass it on to you.
Thank you, Melinda. Hello to everybody that are our audience and our panelists. I wanted to have a great panel today. So let me begin by sharing a few artworks from the World on Fire exhibition. As you can see, this is a diverse body of work that responds to the climate crisis in different media. Images of fire, extinct animals, burning buffalo, and exquisite aquatints of endangered insects. I urge everyone to visit the Center for the Arts Eagle Rock website and social media site to see each work of art in greater detail. I'd like to thank Melinda Ann Farrell for her tireless efforts in making this show a reality. Our installer, Chris Marble, our technical wizards for today as well, Summer Benton and Asher Titan, and a mighty shout out to Los Angeles Printmaking and the special guest artists who shared their time and talent. To my colleagues in the biology department at Occidental College, Professor John McCormack, Professor Gretchen North, Professor Amber Stubler, and Professor Amanda Zellmer. I'm grateful they are sharing their research into the natural world and how their findings create a window into the realities we face with climate change. Over my tenure teaching printmaking at Occidental, many of my best students have been biology majors, I'm sorry. I think this is because they embody many of the same characteristics that make a good artist. Their heightened powers of observation, their careful attention to detail, their problem-solving skills, and affinity for the natural world. I see these same qualities in our panelists. And I'm excited to hear our panelists present their research on conservation, sustainability, and the many ways we can actively protect our planet. And as educators, we share a common goal to engage the next generation of artists and scientists to support the flora, fauna, and habitats of the world around us. Please join me in welcoming John, Gretchen, Amber, and Amanda. And I will first introduce John, Dr. McCormack. Dr. John McCormack is a director and curator of the Moore Laboratory of Zoology and at Occidental College. In this unique vintage museum, an important bird collection enables students to study DNA technology, biodiversity, and engage in scientific investigation on the evolutionary history of birds and recent human-caused environmental changes that affect bird distribution. John is an excellent bird detective, I call him, because often I will send him an image of a bird while I'm traveling, and John will respond right back to me what that bird is and where we are. So it's been a fun game that we play together. And so wherever I go in the world, I can depend on my bird detective. So John, I think you can go ahead with your research.
Thank you so much, Linda. And thank you to Center for the Arts, Eagle Rock, and for the attendees. Well, they asked me to present a little bit about my research and how it intersects with climate change. So I want to tell you a little story about the Moore Laboratory of Zoology at Occidental College. It's what we call a natural history collection. It was started by Robert T. Moore, who was one of the last gentleman naturalists of his era, kind of in the mold of Charles Darwin. He wanted to describe the birds of Mexico to Western science. So he hired a fellow named Chester Lamb, a well-known Los Angeles ornithologist from the early 1900s, to crisscross Mexico collecting birds. And by the time he was done, 22 years later, Lamb had put together the largest Mexican bird collection in the world. That collection is now an international resource to better understand bird diversity, evolution, and believe it or not, from these photos, conservation of birds. Essentially what it is, and what all natural history collections are, is a portal back in time before our current climate crisis and a world on fire. One of our current projects is called the Mexican Bird Resurvey Project. Our goal here is to compare the birds from Moore and Lamb's time to those found today. And one of our most recent trips was to the Sierra San Pedro Martir, a mountain range not too far away, really a day's trip to northern Baja where we went with cameras. The mountain is a land of giants, huge meadows surrounded by expanses of forests, enormous pine trees studded with giant boulders. The habitat is actually well protected as a national park. It's one of Mexico's oldest national parks. So we knew any changes we found there wouldn't be caused by loss of habitat. Using rephotography, we documented this, finding little change to the number of trees and the size of trees. Here's a photo comparison on the right from just a few years ago, and on the left from the early 1900s. Here you see on the top, this is a photo from the 1920s, and then on the bottom from a few years ago, a huge pine tree lies in the meadow, part of the natural cycle of tree birth and death. So well protected that no one even hauled away the fallen tree for fuel. But not everything was the same here. The meadow was drier, the lake was gone. And as for the birds, we noted a new arrival, a bird called the rock wren, found only in dry, very arid habitats. It's a very small, very nondescript bird, but Lamb would not have missed it. And its presence there, kind of like the missing lake, was a sign of a warmer and drier mountain than in Lamb's day. It was kind of a harbinger of climate change. The news there was not all bad. Another addition, but the welcome kind, California condors. I counted 30 of these birds in the air at one time, which is close to 10% of its total number on Earth. And it included some that were even born in the wild without tags for their identification. We are changing the planet, sometimes for the worse, but the California condor shows that we can also protect it and reverse that change. So we'll be returning to Mexico when we can for more resurveys. In the meantime, we're doing other kinds of research in the collection there at Occidental, in the DNA laboratory, to understand how birds are changing. We hope you can drop by sometime soon and see the collection, as well as this beautiful mural put together by Jane Kim of Inkdwell Studios. She conjured up something truly magical for us on a theme of Southern California from sea to sky. We hope that it is an inspiring note of a city and its wildlife coexisting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Next, I would like to introduce Professor Gretchen North. She's the John McMenamin Endowed Chair of Biology. Her research focuses on how plants cope with physically challenging conditions such as fire, rising temperatures, and the relationship of water and plants in the rainforest. Dr. North has inspired generations of her students to continue careers in helping the environment, and she will share two recent graduates who we both admire, and they are now working in the field. So, Dr. North, you want to start?
Okay, Dr. Lyke, thank you. As a matter of fact, I just realized that just because I'm so accustomed to it, but every day when I sit down in front of my computer to speak to people on Zoom, I look at a picture by Linda and it has fire in the background of the lovely footpath and a bridge over it and the fire encroaching. And I think that sort of reminds me of what I'm doing here. So, and I want to thank Linda for the invitation and Melinda and everyone else involved. So thank you and thanks for coming. All right, I am a plant physiological ecologist, which means that I study how plants cope with pretty challenging environments. And my students and I work also in these very challenging environments, but with some of the world's toughest plants, such as cacti. The habitats that we work in are in very different biomes, that is, different places with different assemblages of living things. For instance, the desert versus the rainforest. But all of these habitats are likely to change dramatically under hotter, drier conditions, and that change has already begun. So first of all, just a study that we did a while ago on one of the world's toughest plants, in that it has almost the highest temperature that's ever been recorded before it dies. So you can heat it up to 133 degrees Fahrenheit and it'll remain alive. But you go further than that, up to 135, and it dies. And indeed, we did an experiment where we just put the plants up in two different types of soil on the roof of the biology building at Oxy. And sure enough, it was 110 air temperature for over a week. That is the high of each day. And the ones on the left that are just in sandy soil, the ones that are labeled dead, are dead, but the ones that are in rocky soil remained alive, which is why you always find this living rock cactus surrounded by rocks. That's the only type of habitat in which it can survive. And one of the take-home messages from this is that this cactus, if we want it to continue in the wild where the temperature is increasing, we've really got to preserve these microhabitats. And in order to preserve the microhabitats, you've got to basically preserve a large habitat to make sure that just these little pockets remain. All right, next slide, please. We've also been involved in a long-term survey of vegetation changes in the Sonoran Desert around here, particularly near Palm Desert. There's a reserve, and every 5 years or so, teams of people go out and try to measure how many new seedlings have been recorded along what we call these transects. Here, this is right after the mega drought, of which we're actually sort of still in, but in 2017, looking at mortality and at recruitment of new seedlings, we found very few new seedlings. The plants, the adult plants are even sort of having a hard time. Like the red circle here is around a cactus, a really tough cookie, but it's dead. However, with a couple of summers of rain that we have had, there has been recovery. So it's not all bad news. All right, next slide, please. So also, I look at plants that are water stressed in an odd environment, that is the rainforest. The plants that I look at tend to grow up in the canopy, which is why we employ the human pyramid that you see there on the left, with the tallest undergraduate at the top there, to access these plants and see just how they can cope, first of all, with drought, and then if they dry down, how they can cope with the intense heat, which is what we're measuring in the top photograph there, is basically how hot is it. We're in what's called a light gap. We actually called it the light gap from hell because it was so hot, measuring the temperatures. There is another student here that I want to point out. As Linda said, the best artists are biologists and vice versa, and she's Sarah there, she's one of both. And then I want to go around, there's Marvin, who's demonstrating how not to wear masks for COVID times. But then also just the bottom of the pyramid here is a woman, Carly Phillips, who got her PhD after Oxy, and then became a charter member of the Union for Concerned Scientists. So she's employed by them 6 months of the year to go to the Arctic, which is another biome that I want to mention here just briefly. So next slide. So Carly and her team have actually been investigating fire in the Arctic Circle. And fire in the Arctic Circle is a real tragedy because the Arctic is actually a warehouse, a storage for carbon. So carbon comes in, but it doesn't go out. It just gets stored in the Arctic soil when it's frozen. As the Arctic soil thaws, that carbon begins to be released to the atmosphere. And in addition, as it gets warmer and drier, the forests burn, and even the soil burns because it's so organic. So Carly's team is recommending that actually there we really fight fires. That's where we fight fires, is in the Arctic, if we want to conserve the carbon balance of the planet. All right, next slide, please. Then closer to home, I have students who work on the urban forest of Los Angeles. It's a really, really important, I consider it a biome, the urban forest, because there's so much potential there for reversing some of what we've done to the climate. And you've probably heard of urban heat islands. I think you'll hear about them a little bit from Amanda, perhaps. But the one way that we can do something about urban heat islands is to plant urban trees. And I know that there is sort of controversy about greening and gentrification, but greening for taking up carbon, I'm going to stand by it. One of my students here, Diego Zapata on the left, he had graduated 2 years ago, and he now works for a wonderful organization called Northeast Trees. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe you've even gone to some of their programs. And in addition, just to tie in the art motif, he also works for Metabolic Studio, which has done a lot of art projects, particularly along the LA River. And he knows how important the urban forest is. So I'm just going to close with what I gather he's saying, because I'm reading the transcript of his talk here. One of his goals, and one of the goals of Northeast Trees, is to preserve and foster resilient living systems in my community, but also ensure that these green spaces are accessible and beneficial to, and I'm just going to add all there. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen. That was wonderful, and it's great to see pictures of our former students who are doing well. I wanted to next welcome Dr. Amber Stubler, a marine biologist. Professor Stubler studies the impact of climate change and ocean acidification, the marine community ecology of kelp and coral reef ecosystems, including the Caribbean coral reefs. Professor Stubler's work is immensely important for the future of biodiversity in the ocean. Thank you for doing your presentation, Amber.
Sure, and thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. So for those of you who aren't familiar with marine ecology, my research mainly focuses on how humans are impacting marine ecosystems and how the species within those ecosystems interact. So the study systems that I focus on primarily have been coral reefs and seagrasses, but now that I'm in California, I've also shifted some of my focus to our local kelp forest ecosystems, as well as some of our restoration projects here, like restoring the natural oyster beds. And hopefully it will not come as a surprise to anyone in this panel when I say that unfortunately humans have had a vast and negative impact on marine ecosystems. Whether that's indirect or direct, many of these impacts are running the gamut from the very obvious things like physical damage and destructive fishing processes to much more global scale things like temperature rise and ocean acidification. You can go ahead to the next one too. And of these, the last two impacts, the global impacts, temperature rise and ocean acidification, I would say the temperature is probably the most widespread in terms of general public knowledge, and that's because a lot of the ecosystems that are very near and dear to our hearts, like coral reefs, have been really impacted by increasing temperatures. So I'm sure many of you have heard about the massive bleaching events that have happened on the Great Barrier Reef. You can go to the next slide. Where we see these normally very healthy and robust ecosystems lose their zooxanthellae, which are these very special symbiotic plants that live within the coral, and that's what gives them this beautiful color, and also what helps to sustain this very broad ecosystem. Unfortunately, these small plants in the coral don't really like the increasing temperatures, so much so that whenever temperatures increase past a certain point, the algae, oops, too far. Can we go back a couple? Sorry. The algae actually abandon the corals entirely. And you see here in the middle that we go from a very healthy reef on the left to something that is what we call a bleached reef, which has no more of these algae associating with the coral. And that will unfortunately eventually turn to dead coral if the heat wave doesn't end very quickly. And it's interesting because temperature, although there are so many threats to reefs, temperature has been identified as the single greatest threat to reefs worldwide. And experts generally agree that a temperature increase of about 1.5 degrees centigrade will increase or result in a loss of about 70 to 90% of corals. And even worse, if we hit an overall average increase of 2 degrees Celsius, we're likely to see over 99% of the coral reefs die. So on the other side of this equation is ocean acidification. And this is probably something that fewer people overall know about. It's less talked about. Part of that is because the impacts of ocean acidification are much more gradual and much less obvious in the immediate future. So go to the next slide. The simple premise of ocean acidification is that whenever you have CO2 mixing with seawater, that seawater becomes slightly more acidic. You can think of it as if you add CO2 to your tap water, if you have one of those little bubbly systems, you have seltzer water, which is much more acidic than just regular neutral tap water. So the same analogous situation is happening in our oceans. With the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, we get an increase in CO2 in the water. Next slide, please. This is a graph. I know it's a little intimidating at first, but if you pay attention to the red line, This is just the CO2 in our atmosphere increasing since about the mid 1950s to 2010. It's a little old, I apologize. But that blue line that I've circled, that's the PCO2, which is just the amount of CO2 that's in seawater. So you see that the atmospheric CO2 and the seawater CO2 track they're very much in line, so they're tracking together. And the green line at the bottom is the pH of the ocean. Now, we're probably more familiar with pH whenever you think about things like lemon. pH, acidic is a lemon, acidic is battery acid. The ocean itself starts at about a pH of 8.1, and that's average pH for the whole ocean. You can go ahead to the next slide. It varies depending on local areas, but the projected decrease in pH is going to be about 0.4 pH units to about 7.8. And I know I've just thrown a lot of numbers at you, but since we're all Californians, I think we're familiar with the Richter scale. The Richter scale is a logarithmic scale. So if I asked you if there's a difference between an earthquake that's 4.0 and 4.4, we would all know instinctively that that's actually quite a large difference. So I want you to think about that when you think about the pH scale. Next slide, please. That if we drop from a pH of 8.1 or 8.2 to the projected 7.8, 7.9, this is actually a substantial increase in the acidity level of our oceans. And we won't actually feel this. So if you and I go swimming in the water, we're not going to notice that acidity level. But for the organisms pictured here, other way. Thanks. The organisms pictured here, sea urchins, corals, crustaceans like lobsters, mollusks, these all are going to feel that impact very acutely. And this is because their shells are made of calcium carbonate or limestone, and that limestone is only formed in a very specific pH. So if it becomes too acidic, these organisms can't physically form their shells. Next slide, please. Here's just a quick demonstration of that. So I just want you to pay attention to the top panel and the lower panel. So the top panel is showing the average CO2 concentration pre-industrial times, and that's a clam grown under those conditions. And I want you to compare that visually to the bottom panel, where this clam is grown in conditions that we expect for the year 2100, 2150 or so. These are very extreme differences. Grown under the exact same conditions, the scale bars are the same. The clam overall, you can see, is not only smaller, but the shell is thinner. And if you look particularly at the hinge part there, so that's what makes the clam open and close, you can see that the hinge is sort of starting to degrade entirely. And you can imagine that this is happening in clams, but it's also happening in things like fish in the next slide, where on the left-hand side, we see fish larvae grown under normal everyday conditions of CO2, compared to fish larvae on the right two panels that were grown in that higher level projected in the year 2100, where their skeleton is actually completely malformed because of their inability to form shells or bones like they should. Okay, so these are all impacting the balance between the growth processes that are happening in the ocean, but unfortunately, it's also impacting breakdown processes. So that's where I study. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see this coral on the left is what a coral looks like in an ecosystem, very happy and healthy. The coral on the right is an ecosystem where everything is still happy and healthy, but this is a result of really heavy urchin activity. So urchins break down carbonate, and that's a totally natural process. Unfortunately, with acidification, that process is happening faster and easier. And so you can see here, the coral on the top was grown under current conditions. This is a coral skeleton. And the coral on the bottom was grown under conditions that mimicked year 2100. And you can see the big chunks taken out of the coral. It becomes much easier for these breakdown processes that are natural and healthy to break down the coral, which unfortunately speeds the entire dissolution of the reef. So as we are moving forward, we're seeing, next slide, sorry, a decrease in coral growth. And at the same time, we're seeing an increase in coral breakdown, and that leads to an overall net loss of reef. And this is a problem, of course, because we can imagine that this is greatly impacting the structural integrity of reefs. And that means that as we move forward in the future, next slide, we'll go from reefs looking like we have now, where there's relatively healthy coral cover, shifting slowly into much more of an algal cover reef with fewer coral, and eventually to a point where there will be less coral and potentially zero coral. So I think it's safe to say that coral reefs as we know them currently are changing. And that's where my research is focused, understanding those change processes and really monitoring them so that we can understand how the reefs are changing and how we might intervene when necessary. So if we go to the next slide, you see some of my students working on a monitoring project. Next slide, yeah, thanks. Where we're surveying the reef and just looking to see how many corals are reproducing every year. So this is a long-term project I've had in Jamaica for the last 12 years. And every year we look to see how many corals are growing, just trying to understand how healthy the population is. Are there new corals coming? Are the old corals dying? That's just so we can have a better sense of the reef dynamics that are happening. And the next picture is just us, some of my students in Jamaica. You can go forward. So I feel every time I talk about my research, I feel like it's a little bit of a downer. So I wanted to leave you with maybe a hopeful moment here. This is a coral called Oculita patagonica, excuse me. And this coral is grown under normal seawater conditions in the top picture. And then it was also grown under really, really acidic conditions in the bottom picture. And that's a very extreme acidity level. So not something that we expect in our next 100 or 200 years. But you'll see that the coral itself actually lived for 12 months in these conditions. And the great thing about this is that the researchers actually took this coral that was in the acidity or the acidified water, and then after 12 months, they put it back into normal seawater. Next slide. And what happened was really shocking because the coral actually started to regrow its skeleton. And so this is maybe something that I like to point to, because I don't want everybody to think that all hope is lost for the oceans. If we're able to change our conditions and our patterns of the ocean, there is some hope that these corals and other organisms will be able to rebound. But this does require that we make sort of immediate action, or take immediate action and make immediate changes, so that we can prevent the organisms themselves from being lost entirely. And with that, sorry, we can go on to the next two slides. And with that, I just wanted to thank you very much for inviting me here. I am sort of the token marine ecologist, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have about how the ocean itself interacts with the atmosphere. It's a pretty complex system, but I'm happy to answer as much as I can.
Thank you so much, Amber. That was brilliant. And we do need to do something immediately and help marine life in every way we can. So let us move on to our final panelists. And I'd like to introduce Amanda Zellmer. Professor Zellmer uses multiple scientific data collecting methods to find the most effective ways to connect isolated habitat for the endangered animals in California. Her research also focuses on utilizing computational methods to study evolutionary and ecological processes for conservation biology. So with that, Amanda, you can hopefully show your slides. Talk about your fields.
Thank you, Linda. I wanted to start out just thanking the Center for the Arts Eagle Rock. It is an honor for me to be here today and to have you all invite me. My daughter has for a long time gone to the camp, the summer camp at Center for the Arts Eagle Rock. So when she found out that I was going to be a panelist tonight, she was really excited, and we just have absolutely loved all of the experiences that we have had with CFAER so far. So thank you so much. So you might be wondering what a computational biologist is doing at this panel tonight. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the work that we do and how we use computers to study processes related to conservation biology and studying how habitat change, climate change, urbanization, all the things that we're doing to the planet affect species, different wildlife, where they live, and where they might live into the future. So this is just a picture of me and a few of the students in my lab up in the San Gabriel Mountains, just north of Eagle Rock. So we don't just work on computers, we also get out into the field and actually collect some data as well that we then bring back to the lab and use to help us model where species live. Next slide, please. So I'm not technically an artist, but I like to think of myself as an artist sometimes when I am creating these beautiful maps. I like to spend a lot of time figuring out the best ways to illustrate where species live and how the environment might be affecting where they can live. So this is an image of Southern California and the distribution where this tiny salamander that you see on the side lives. These are slender salamanders and they live all over Eagle Rock. If you happen to have any shady, cool, moist spots in your backyard or in your neighborhood where there's some logs or rocks, if you go out during the rainy months in the winter, even still right now, and you flip over those logs, you might find a couple slender salamanders underneath the logs. They look like worms. Most people mistake them for worms when they first see them, but if you look really closely, they have teeny tiny arms and legs as well. And so what's shown on the top of the screen here, the two maps on the top, are two different representations of where these salamanders live in Southern California. The warm areas, the yellow colors, are places where they live, and the purple areas are places that have a climate that's not appropriate for them. So maybe it's too cold or it's too dry. And what we're trying to do with these computational models is try to predict under a changing climate where they might be. Now, we don't know exactly how the climate is going to change. It's possible that, that we clean up our act, we reduce our carbon emissions, and we don't have as much of a change in climate in the next 50 to 100 years. But it's also possible that we just stay business as usual and keep polluting the planet, and climate change is even greater. And so what we try to do is figure out what is the range of possibilities of how our environment might change. And as a result, how would these species then respond to that change? So for most animals, we tend to think that under a changing climate, that they will likely move towards the poles, so towards the North Pole or the South Pole if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, so that they can get to a cooler region or a cooler climate, right? The other thing that they could do is to move up in elevation. So you can kind of see the mountains here at the top of the Los Angeles region. That's another place where they might move, is just move up into the mountains where it's going to be a little bit cooler. The problem is you can only move up so high before you run out of habitat completely because it just gets too warm. So moving up a mountain results in less and less habitat. So what we have down on the bottom are two different projections of where there might be suitable habitat for these salamanders in the future under different conditions, either business as usual on the left, where we continue to pollute the planet, or on the right, if we clean up our act and they don't get too affected by climate change. Okay, next slide, please. We don't just have salamanders here in Los Angeles. We have so many different species because Southern California is a very biodiverse region. So we could be looking for these tiny little salamanders in our backyards, but we can also look for all of these larger mammals that are wandering around in the green spaces in LA. Los Angeles is a really unique place to study the impacts of human-mediated changes, such as urbanization, because we have such a diversity of wildlife, including things like mountain lions. Los Angeles is only one of 2 megacities in the world that has large predatory cats like mountain lions. Bobcats, we have skunk, bear, mule deer, coyote, foxes, multiple species of rabbits, you name it. Many different species that we can study. Next slide, please. So how are we studying these species? The best way to do it, because it's not very easy to just go out and find a mountain lion. The best way to do it is by using camera traps. So this is the other way that I get to be an artist, is by taking lots of pictures of wildlife. And I love going through, you can see this picture behind me in my, my background is a picture that one of my camera traps took at this exact location. And what we're trying to do is get pictures of what wildlife are out there, where they are, what they're doing, where they're moving, to try to get an understanding, a baseline understanding right now, so that in the future we have something to compare to. Next slide, please. So a couple of things that we can do with these data once we get them. So one of the things that we've been looking at over the last year, an unexpected project, was to see what the impacts of the COVID-19 shutdown were on wildlife. Maybe during the beginning of the shutdown, you saw all of the social media posts, the news posts about wildlife reclaiming cities. People were showing pictures of deer in Griffith Park. There were pictures of monkeys in different cities around the world. And so as an urban ecologist, I sat there thinking, okay, this is great that we're seeing all this wildlife, but I know that this wildlife has always been here. So is it really true that wildlife are moving around and reoccupying cities during the shutdown, this major shift in human behavior when we just stopped moving, we stopped driving on the roads, we stopped going downtown, going to businesses? Or is it really that people just became more observant during that time, that people were stuck at home, they were looking around in their backyards, they were looking out their window with nothing to do, they couldn't go to the mall, they couldn't go to the movie theater, and maybe they were just noticing more? So because we have this long-term data, this baseline data, we're able to then go in and see, did we get more pictures of wildlife during that COVID-19 shutdown? So that's one of the things that we're working on right now. These are all pictures that were taken during that first month of the shutdown at just a single camera. And you can see a diversity of species from bobcats to coyotes. We have a couple different rodents, including a kangaroo rat. We have multiple bird species and rabbits all at the same location during that time. Next slide, please. The other thing that we're using these data for is to understand where wildlife corridors are in our city, and also to try to predict where it would be a good place to try to restore and establish new corridors so that wildlife populations can stay connected. The reason why this is important is because wildlife need to have an opportunity to find mates. They need to be able to find food. If there are fires, they need to be able to escape habitats and move to other habitats for safety and for water. So establishing and maintaining connectivity across the urban green spaces is really important. So what you're looking at here, another, what I think, beautiful map of Southern California. We're right about in the middle. That thumb in the middle is Griffith Park, and we're just to the right of that in Eagle Rock. What you're looking at here is a representation of connectivity for 9 different terrestrial mammals across all of Southern California, or at least across the Los Angeles region. The light green areas are highly connected or undeveloped habitat, and the dark areas are places that are highly urbanized and unlikely to have wildlife moving through them. And so what we can do with this map is we can figure out where are wildlife still connected. Can they get to Elysian Park by Dodger Stadium? Can they get to Griffith Park? Can they get over to the San Rafael Mountains? Can they get over to the Verdugo Mountains and back up into the San Gabriel Mountains to be able to find the resources and the habitat that they need to survive? Next slide, please. So we can't just do this ourselves. Being able to make those models takes a ton of data. It means that we need to have records of wildlife all over the place in the city. Me as a scientist, I can go out and I can set up a few camera traps. I can go out and take pictures of the, wildlife, at one park in a given day or a couple parks in a given day. But because we're in Los Angeles and there are so many of you spread out all over the place, we can actually amass so much scientific data that's not only useful for us right now as scientists, but will also be crucial for the future, because we can do things like what John mentioned in the first talk. Someone 100 years from now can come back and say, look, I've got pictures of bobcats in the Verdugos. Do we still have those here 100 years from now? Or are they gone? Why are they gone? How is the climate change such that they can't live there anymore? So you all are super important for this because you can collect that data in your own backyards in these tiny patches of habitat that wildlife still live in, where all of my tiny little salamanders live. If you want to get involved, I recommend getting an account on iNaturalist, where you can upload your photos. And it's not only good for me, it doesn't just get me data. Your data go into these global databases that scientists around the world can freely access and use. But also it's important for you because you can get help with identifying and learning about the species that are in your backyard. So when you upload a photo, anyone in the community can comment on that and help you identify which species it is. Is it the garden slender salamander or the black-bellied slender salamander? So many different things that you can do, and then you can learn about those species as well. Next slide, please. Another way that you can get involved is by working with this nonprofit organization that I partner with. The Arroyos and Foothills Conservancy is located right here in the Northeast LA, Pasadena, Glendale, Burbank, Altadena area. And they're actively involved in preserving habitats, so purchasing areas that would be really important for wildlife corridors, for instance, doing restoration work, trail maintenance, and outreach and education. So they have many different ways to get involved. So if you're interested in any of this and protecting our local environment for the wildlife that live here, this is a really great way to get involved. Next slide, please. With that, I'll say thank you. It's really been a pleasure speaking to you all tonight. You can contact me. I've got my email address here or our lab Instagram account if you want to follow along with the research that we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, so much. That was really such an interesting result in terms of looking at urban. I'm going to send photographs because I take them all the time. So look out for them. Thank you so much. So all of you for sharing your research. That was wonderful. And I love that we're having this dialogue. I think artists look at the environment in different ways, and scientists can also in great ways influence how we understand the threat of climate change. And that's really what we want to try to help slow down. So I was going to launch into a few questions that we talked about earlier, and then see in a bit what we have in the chat. So my first question would be, as a scientist, how has your worldview been shaped by climate change? And what do you think is the highest priority for addressing climate change? I know there's lots of them, so we're just trying to get you to kind of throw out some ideas.
I'll take a crack at it. I'm going to answer your second question first, is what can you do? And I think it really depends on who you are and what your habits are. If you're sort of a comfortable person in Los Angeles with property and a car, stop driving your car so much. Stop buying stuff. That's a very different recommendation, though, from one I would give to, say, a person maybe in Costa Rica, where I go, who maybe doesn't have the resources and doesn't waste the resources. It's amazing what they do. They compost everything that's compostable. So there are, I think for us, we really have to change our habits instantly. For instance, all the waste that was generated during COVID, Amber, I'm sure, can testify to that. It's going into the oceans. And we really, so so essentially buy less, drive less. You're gonna have to do something else for amusement. That's the recommendation from here.
I've got kind of a recommendation that comes from an evolutionary biologist. And it's something really that we've been talking about for years in biology, which is preserving species' ability to adapt. So things are changing pretty rapidly, and we know that species are going to have to make some changes, and they can do that to some extent if they have variability. And so often we get focused on preserving, like, okay, if we just have one population of something, then we're good. And people rarely think about preserving many different populations, many different individuals to kind of capture as much variability as they can. And it's that variability that sort of drives species' ability to change and adapt. So that's something that doesn't always really make it to the fore in conservation efforts, but I think it's something that is really critical for species moving forward.
Yeah, I would echo that for the marine world as well. I think that preserving ecosystems rather than species is probably the most efficient way to go about it. In the same light of John saying we should be making sure that they have the ability to adapt. The oceans are extremely resilient, but they need to have the ability to bounce back from these everything we're throwing at it.
I'll also throw in there that, we can all do our part by just looking in our own yards, our own neighborhoods, and thinking about what we can do to preserve habitat there. Because the more habitat that is there, the more places for species to find refuge under changing climates. One thing I forgot to mention in my talk, this is especially important in urban areas because with the built environment that we have here, all of the concrete, all of the asphalt, we're actually changing the temperature of our community. We have increased temperatures in urban areas, especially in a city like Los Angeles that is so vast, has so much concrete. And as a result, that's increasing the temperatures for all of the wildlife in our neighborhoods, right? So the more we can do to keep green spaces green, whether that's in your backyard, a park in the neighborhood, anything like that is going to help reduce that effect of climate change within the cities.
So Amber, I wanted to segue because earlier you talked about how we need coastal marine protection. And I thought that was a great revelation to be like, it's important where you protect the oceans. And you mentioned that. So I learned something earlier today that maybe you can share with our audience a little bit.
Yeah, sure. We were during our little practice run through, we were just discussing about how we could best protect the ocean in terms of there's this idea that marine protected areas are an excellent way. This is similar to what we do on land, where we have areas that we preserve as wilderness areas or areas that we don't use to extract resources from. The idea being that that could be we could have those same types of areas in the ocean. And I think that that's a great idea, and I think it's vital for the long-term preservation of biodiversity. But I think that as we start to really develop those marine protected areas, we should make sure that we're putting them in the right places. So for instance, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there's a lot less overall. It's just a very vast watery area with a lot fewer species than if we were, say, on the coast of California, where we have these really important ecosystems that really are the lifeline to major fish species. That they serve as nursery grounds, they serve as shoreline stabilization. So there's really all sorts of ecosystem services that come from coastal environments that are arguably more important to preserve than just vast swaths of the open ocean. So I think that we can be smart about where we put these marine protected areas so that they can be more they will pay more dividends in the long term if we are able to put them in particular areas. So that's something that, as we were talking about things that you all could do to help as voters, things will often come up, especially locally for marine protected areas, because many people are nervous about having them, particularly people who like to use ocean resources like fishing and diving and exploring. And it's one of those things that everybody gets a little nervous when they hear that it's going to be protected and they might not be able to access it. But really educating yourself about the local legislation that's going on to protect marine areas in your region is probably really critical, so that you can be an informed citizen whenever you vote on those different propositions.
Thank you, Amber. John, we've experienced these major mega fires recently in California during the last several years, getting worse, and lost so much. I was wondering how bird species were affected, and you mentioned earlier, I was thinking of the major flyways that you document and how we need the wetlands. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that or answer some questions, answer the question about how birds can avoid wildfires, or if they.
Right. I mean, we tend to think of birds migrating as just, they kind of just fly all over the place. They make it north and south, every which how, multiple different directions. But the fact is, they know to go in certain places that are better migratory corridors, and so if those places get hit hard by fire, that's going to make a big impact. And so one of the places recently we started monitoring bird migration in the San Gabriel Mountains, the western San Gabriels. It's a spot called Bear Divide, just above Silmar in the San Gabriels. And this is just like this amazing bird migration corridor where there's a low saddle in the mountains, and you can stand there and just watch the birds come by in the hundreds and the thousands. So what we've been doing this migration season is actually like counting them, like literally counting every single bird some mornings that comes by, which species, how many. And the hope is that we can start again collecting data. I know that some people think, okay, well, the time to collect data is maybe gone, right? We need to act, and that's true, but we still do need to collect data. We need to continue monitoring to understand the impacts. And so should this place, God forbid, ever get hit by fire, we could have a baseline for understanding how things might change.
Great. Gretchen, I was thinking about the extreme heat in the desert and mega fires, and how these fires have really affected, in California, our iconic sequoia trees, the Pacific redwoods, and even Joshua tree. What are the ways that California can save these treasures? Have you thought about that, or anybody, if you're like, I think we're trying things, but I know Gretchen had some ideas earlier.
Well, actually, it's kind of interesting. I mean, it depends on where you are in California. For instance, we talked earlier about something that is lumped under a term called indigenous fire management. That varies also according to the indigenous peoples that you're talking about. But let's just say here in California, the most active group is in Northern California. And their plan to deal with the mega fires that have arisen recently is really sound, and is actually being subscribed to now by the Forest Service. And what it is, it's really going back to sort of managed burning and regular and frequent burning to clear out the undergrowth and to make sure that any fire that goes through doesn't have this huge stock of fuel, which causes it to turn into a mega fire. That really works for Northern California. It's probably not the recommendation for down here, because we have such terrible winds, and essentially we don't have the stockpile of fuel that there is in Northern California. Oddly enough, some trees like the redwood, the coast redwood, it's actually adapted to fire. It's one of the very few conifers that will resprout. So as long as the fire is not too hot and doesn't kill the top of the tree, it will regenerate. And in Big Basin and everything, it's regenerating now. Joshua tree, however, is a terrible story, because what's happened there is that invasive grasses have come in. It's happened in the Sonoran Desert as well. So these are ecosystems that really never did sustain fire. Fire would come and it would, a lightning strike, it would burn maybe one or two big plants, and then it would die out because there was a lack of fuel. But now, with all of the invasive species, there is fuel. So sadly, the only recommendations there are to get rid of the invasive species. And you and I talked about goats. I like the idea of goats. I really do. Managed goats. That's a tough one. Yeah.
I thought of them because we went on a goat hike in Joshua Tree, which was just a wonderful experience. and they were eating everything, all the grasses that they could find.
Good, good. Yeah.
So,
Can you
So-
clarify though, Linda, what you meant by a goat hike?
there's a French farmer outside of Joshua Tree who has offered these goat hikes. Only 10 people can go at a time. He has 19 goats, and you go out for 3 hours into the brush, into the little low hillsides and rocks, and they just stay with us. It was just the most wonderful experience. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. I'm going to go again. So I had one last question for Amanda. What conservation efforts can people listening today support, and what steps can they take to reduce our impact on local species and encourage biodiversity? I think you kind of answered that, so I don't know if you wanted to add anything else or not.
Yeah. So yeah, I talked a little bit about how people can get involved with community science, how you can get involved with protecting habitat in our local environment. Things that you can do in your own yard is to plant native plants. Actually, somebody just came to talk to me the other day that the city of Glendale has been discussing converting a number of their grass fields, their grass soccer fields, to AstroTurf. And so they were wondering, what are the impacts of AstroTurf on wildlife in the area? And, you know, I did a quick, I had actually not heard of anybody doing a study on this. So I did a quick search online on Google Scholar and came up with very few studies. And the only study that I know about, even related to that, is a friend of mine, a colleague of mine who works at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles, Greg Pauly, has studied how reptiles, how often they're observed in more natural habitat versus in lawns. And what he's found is that lawns are just as bad as a parking lot for reptiles. You are more likely, he has almost zero observations of reptiles in lawns because they're just so, there's just so little biodiversity of the prey items that reptiles might be hunting for in those areas. You have like 30% less diversity in the insects that are there. And so, you know, this sort of relates back to that AstroTurf study. I mean, whatever is not in the lawns is especially not going to be in the AstroTurf. So ways that you can get involved are by converting your lawns into natural habitat, having native plants that wildlife in the area can forage in. That'll instantly increase the insect biodiversity in your yards. It'll increase the then the reptiles that are in your yards that are depending on those insects. It'll also increase the bird species that you see in your yard. And then the other thing you can do is you can participate in your local government to prevent things like having our natural areas converted to non-natural habitat. And I say this as being a soccer mom, somebody who spends a lot of time out on these fields. You know, there are ways to have these things in our environment, but not necessarily convert everything to plastic and artificial materials.
Thank you. Then I had one last question because I wanted us to at least talk about hopeful stories. And if any of you have a hopeful story or a success story that you would like to share, that would be great. And Amanda, you talked about a certain mountain lion. Why don't you tell that? I thought that was a wonderful story.
Yeah, so just related to this idea of World on Fire, right? The concept of this art exhibit. So everyone's aware of the Bobcat fire that we had this past year. And shortly after the Bobcat fire, or during the Bobcat fire, a mountain lion who's since been named Monrovia was found hiding underneath a house in Monrovia with her paws burned from the fire. So if you live up in the mountains or up in the foothills, you probably know how fire travels when it happens in our hillsides. But if not, just so that everybody's on the same page, what happens is once a spark gets over a hillside or over a ridge into the canyon, the adjacent canyon, all of a sudden it's going to hit all of this fresh plant material, right, that it can then catch on fire. And so fires will then move up the canyons. And as they do that, if there are any wildlife that are in those canyons, they will get stuck there and not necessarily be able to escape the flames. So wildlife are very susceptible to being impacted by these wildfires, which is why they're always trying to keep the wildfires from jumping over a ridge into the next canyon over. Part of why they're doing it, I would hope it's for the wildlife, but it's also for preserving, homes and land and everything. But anyway, this mountain lion was burned, unfortunately, and CDFW, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, were able to capture her, bring her in and rehabilitate her, and then re-release her back into the wild. And she's been doing great. She's out there in the San Gabriels. They have a close eye on her. She has a GPS collar now, so they can track where she is. And she has been seen in the area. And so I can't say too much about her because they're really protective over her, but I think it's a really promising story because it's one of the first times they've ever rehabilitated a mountain lion from a fire like this and re-released her and had her survive.
Great story. Anybody else? John, you have many stories. I like how you saved the wetlands too. That was a good story.
Right. I mean, you asked me to talk a little bit about the coastal California gnatcatcher. I mean, it's a nice, hopeful story, and it's one. It doesn't particularly link to climate change, but this was a few years ago. A little nondescript bird that happened to be on the endangered species list. And in fact, it was on the list and it had critical habitat associated with it, meaning there's habitat around Southern California that's actually protected from development because of this bird. And we call things like that umbrella species because they sort of cast a protective umbrella over habitats that many other non-listed species are in. So like the Palos Verdes blue butterfly, for example. Well, it so happened that developers and lawyers got together to try to put in a petition to take the bird off the endangered species list, arguing that it wasn't actually a distinct thing. And so this is where, my weird skill set of evolutionary biology and genetics and knowledge about bird taxonomy kind of came to great use for once, it seems, because I could actually weigh in and write a rebuttal paper such that U.S. Fish and Wildlife listened and didn't take the bird off the list.
And they didn't build over the wetlands.
Right, yeah, those 180,000 acres all over Southern California basically remain protected as critical habitat. And now the changes that the Trump administration was proposing to make to weaken the law are, of course, off the table. So it's kind of good news all around for the gnatcatcher and for all the other things in that coastal sage scrub habitat.
Thank you. So Summer, do we have anything in the chat or any other questions that people might want to ask?
That last question looks real fun from Melinda Farrell.
Oh, what was that one?
What are the most dangerous things you've seen when you've been out in the field?
Oh, okay.
I like that one, but somebody else start.
Go ahead.
I can go ahead and start. So I feel like I get to see a lot of incredible things being in the water all the time. I do a lot of scuba diving for my research. And so I see things that many people don't get a chance to, because it's a huge privilege to be able to be underwater and get to see these organisms. But one of my most spectacular experiences was being able to see coral spawning. So if you haven't heard of this, coral spawning is corals, like in my background, once a year they reproduce on the full moon. It's the second full moon of the summer, usually around like August time. And they only have this very tiny window that they do it within. So that as the sun set, it's like 2 hours and 15 minutes after the sunset. It's very precisely timed, because these organisms, what they do is they release their gametes into the water. So they let go of all their eggs and sperm into the water, and then those mix at the surface and fertilize each other. So it has to be timed really exactly so that all of the corals on a reef are spawning at once. So as part of a project with Nancy Knowlton, who is an incredible marine scientist, we were monitoring these coral reefs out in Panama, and you just do swimming laps back and forth over the corals with your flashlights off. So no lights, just swimming in the dark, waiting for the corals to start to release their gametes. And it's really incredible because you can see them start to pop to the surface of the coral. They're like little tiny balls. Like, have you ever seen those cake decorations that are like the silver balls that people put in? Imagine those on a coral, not silver, of course, they're like a yellow color, but all at once, one starts to go, and that releases chemicals into the water that triggers everybody else to release their gametes. And so all of a sudden the water is just filled with these tiny little floating balls, sort of like being in champagne. And of course, what's really cool about this is that it attracts organisms from all over, because this is a feeding event, right? So all the big things come out for this. All the little things come out to eat it, and all the big things come out to eat those. And so you have this incredible amount of action all in this like 2-hour time period. And then by 10 o'clock at night, it's over, right? That's it. So it's really a super special event. And for me, that was probably the most beautiful thing that I've seen in the ocean, just in terms of the timing of everything being so coordinated. It's really quite impressive what these organisms have evolved to do.
That's amazing. You have an amazing life going under the sea and doing all the things that you're doing. Great. Gretchen, go ahead.
So I have one, and it's pretty similar. It's like the terrestrial equivalent of what Amber's talking about, except no reproduction is involved. So it's just actually getting up to the top of a tropical forest canopy. I mean, maybe as a short person, I'm particularly in awe of getting up that high and being above everything else. And so there was this one rickety tower in Panama, and I was actually pretty scared, but just climbing up and then getting to the top and feeling like I just escaped, my earthly bounds, and was looking at a different Earth, because I'd seen it from a different side. But then, just to bring me back, as we were coming back down, there was sort of a nesting box right near the top. And the person I was with opened very carefully the nesting box, and there's a little bush baby just sort of, he's living up there in his own little box. And I just thought, whoa, this is pretty magical. Yeah, this is pretty magical.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I saw that Linda Allen, I think one of our artists, had a question. I can't see the chat right now, so.
Did Amanda want to jump in with her thing?
Amanda, jump in first.
John, you can go first.
Well, mine's a short one, but I was walking through a canyon on my field site. This was a very remote place in northeastern Mexico, Coahuila, Mexico. And I was studying jays, not so different from the scrub jays around here, called Mexican jays. And I noticed down at the bottom of the canyon, several of them were hopping around and sort of making noise. And so I figured they were, after a snake or some kind of predator. This wasn't super uncommon. But as I approached and I looked under this small rock ledge, I saw that there was a perfectly pristine dead jay, one of their own, under there. And seemed like it had died of natural causes, because it had actually got itself underneath this rock ledge and expired. these jays can live 20, 25 years in the wild, so they must have all known each other very well. I don't want to anthropomorphize too much, but I've looked into it a little bit since then, and it seems like what I witnessed was a very rare case of a jay funeral happening.
Wow.
This is something that seems to happen among jays and crows and ravens and some of the other more intelligent birds. So that was pretty special.
Amanda, do you?
I have been stressing over this question for the last 3 panelists while also enjoying all of your stories, because I don't think I could come up with just one. I feel like every time I go out in nature, I see something new that I've never seen before. It's just so beautiful. There's so much to learn. I will say one, which was on a trip that I did with some Occidental College students. We did a 3-week course in Costa Rica and Panama. And during that trip, we spent a night on the Gulf Coast of Costa Rica, where we were helping to monitor sea turtle populations. And what they were doing is, as the sea turtles were coming in and nesting, they were counting the number of eggs that were being laid, where the nests were being laid. And we had to stay up until the middle of the night because you have to go out when it is completely dark with no flashlights at all, and walk up and down the beach for 3 hours in the middle of the night. We all worked in different shifts. And then once we would find a sea turtle, you would then have to watch while she was digging the nest and then laying each of the eggs. And I was also, I guess at that point, probably 6 weeks pregnant. And so you can imagine I was a little tired, a little delirious in the middle of the night. So it was extra special when the, got flies biting you. It just feels awful to be out there. But then this majestic creature shows up and starts laying eggs, and you're in there digging in the dirt, trying to count the eggs while they're being deposited, and she's flicking sand into your face with her powerful feet. It was just one of the most amazing experiences I've had in my life. So yeah, that's just one of many.
Great stories. Summer, do you have any in the chat room that?
Yes, Linda Allen, our co-chair of Center for the Arts Eagle Rock, is wondering about coyotes. She says, I'm wondering about the coyote problem of its habitat being lost, but also the relationship with community and their pets. How the coyote can survive better in the hills. They are coming to major streets, and one wonders how to urge them back into their original habitat now that humans occupy it. Does anyone have any insight on that?
That's a great one for Amanda.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that question. And I know there are a few participants in the room tonight who are probably chuckling because we've had a number of conversations about this because, it really is a sensitive issue, human-wildlife conflict, because you can care about the wildlife that are there, but you also care about your family, you care about your friends, you care about your neighborhood. And it can be really scary to come across a coyote when you're not expecting it, right? So I think this is really important. I think that there are ways that we can prevent that. Again, as I mentioned earlier, about maintaining corridors so that they have access to natural habitat, so that they're not stuck in these little isolated patches of habitat, and the only option is for them to go out into the neighborhoods around them. If you do see coyotes, the best thing to do is to what we call hazing, which is to try to scare them and yell at them, maybe throw some rocks towards them. Obviously, don't throw rocks at them, but just to sort of scare them away from you, because we don't want them coming into our backyards. We don't want them threatening our pets or our families. And they don't want to be there either. We especially don't want them in our neighborhoods because we leave out a lot. And I say we, not me, but collectively, we leave out a lot of rat poison across the city. And if they're eating things like rats in our neighborhoods, they are going to get poisoned and they're going to be sick. So we want them to be in their habitats, which is going to involve not building into those habitats. It's going to involve keeping natural connections between the different environments, keeping those ecosystems healthy so that they can find the prey items that they need in their natural environment. So not killing off gophers and not killing off snakes, not killing off other species that live in those natural environments. And it's going to be a challenge during years like right now when we have this drought, because they're not finding the food that they would normally find there. So, making sure that we're taking steps to prevent climate change so that they're not experiencing these massive droughts.
Okay, are there any other topics that we need to address from the chat or want to address?
There's no other questions in the chat, but if anyone would like to ask questions, we do have time. So while people are thinking of them, I was just wondering, Linda talked earlier about how some of her favorite students in the art department are also biology majors. And then Amanda talked a little bit about how her inner artist comes out when she's making those really colorful, interesting maps. And this is a question for anyone, wondering if you all have any artistic practices and how those might lend themselves into your research and your work.
So are you asking about like our own specific artistic practices?
Yeah, maybe something you do for fun, or what if you utilize any artistic practices in work, or maybe how they may cross over.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd say I'm gonna somewhat deflect that by not answering about myself, but I mean, in the Moore Lab bird collection, for instance, I mean, you saw some of the photos earlier. I mean, beautiful colors, beautiful feathers. And we have a lot of artists that come in and sort of use the specimens for reference and for inspiration. And so I kind of get my inner artist vicariously through that. And I should say that the collection is open as a resource for that if there are any artists watching on.
We had Emily Asher, remember, the Native American artist?
Yes.
Who came and did silk screens with me, but she spent time at Moore Lab taking photographs and borrowed some of the specimens for our exhibition. That was a great show.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Emily Arthur, who she basically, it was about the gnatcatcher story I talked about, and she produced some just amazing works kind of on a theme of science and conservation and uncertainty around data. Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, I just wanted to share one thing that I forgot until Jocelyn Peterson in the art department at Oxy reminded me of, and that is one of my very favorite things that I got to do when I was doing my PhD work, and I had to reproduce exactly what I was seeing under the microscope, and I had to do that wherever I was. So I couldn't, I couldn't always rely on a really good camera. As a matter of fact, I couldn't. So I had to just basically look and draw. I think it's called a camera obscura technique, but I just did it with my eyes and hand, and it was basically you watch and you don't watch your hand and you draw and you just get regions, and it was a kind of you don't lift your hand from the paper, and essentially it's like automatic drawing, and it's, I don't know about the scientific accuracy of it, but I love the images. And Jocelyn had my students do that for a little book they made, just this automatic drawing, and I don't know, it just kind of is so liberating. And I just love to draw. So yeah.
We do that when teaching drawing, called a gesture drawing, that your hand motion, so you really become a close observer then.
Yeah.
You move your eye along a surface, but you're not looking at what you're drawing.
Right.
It just happens, and you get better at it too, don't you?
Yeah, you do. You have to, but it's terrific.
I just saw where Mary Sherwood Brock, who's the artist and active member in the LA art scene and LA printmaking, has a question for us, or somebody.
Yes. Yeah, she has a question for Amber. She's wondering, are the coral reefs along the coast of California in imminent danger? What do you
Oh,
think?
so we don't have any shallow water coral reefs on California, but we do have some deep sea coral reefs, which are a little different than like the background of my coral reef, a little different than what you typically think of as a coral reef. And these deep sea corals are actually incredibly slow growing, and they live to be thousands, hundreds of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, hundreds to thousands of years old. Um, and so they are in danger, but I would actually say that these are less endangered from climate change itself because they are so deep. They don't experience the fluctuations in temperature like the surface coral, the surface communities do. But unfortunately, what is generally considered to be the largest threat to these deep sea environments is ocean trawling for seafood. So whenever there's a so trawling is a type of fishing technique where you drag these very large nets across the seafloor to try and get some of the ground species like flounders or other flat like sole, halibut, flatfishes. And so whenever you're dragging this across the bottom, unless you know that it's a muddy or sandy habitat, it could be potentially taking down some of these more fragile ecosystems that don't regrow as quickly like coral reefs, so or the deep sea corals. So I would say that that's probably the biggest threat. And unfortunately, we typically don't know where deep sea corals are until it's too late, because we've mapped very little of the ocean floor, and these deep sea corals are growing at a depth where humans aren't physically observing them. And so unless there's some reason that we have mapped the ocean floor there and know what's on the bottom, we typically don't know until they're gone and people are trawling up big pieces of corals. So that's sort of the unfortunate thing there. But as far as climate change, deep sea corals are actually relatively safe.
Interesting. We have another question here from Karen Fiorito, another featured artist in World on Fire. She asks, what impact do you think the veganist movement will have on climate change?
Well, if they spread, I think they'll have a positive impact. There's no doubt about it. I mean, cattle generate a lot of methane, but maybe what's even worse in California is the amount of water that they require to sustain those horrible feedlots. I mean, it's just really the most inefficient use of really precious resources like water. And so just cutting out beef is a major step forward. And then the further you go down that road, the better it is. So I'd say, yeah, let's encourage them. Anyway, there's a great person in the economics department who can demonstrate just dollar for dollar exactly what we would save. And that's really in terms of environmental costs that he develops his argument. So yeah, it'd be great. Go for it.
Anything else, Summer, on the chat list that we haven't covered?
Yes, just got a new question from Thelma asking, are there some birds, animals, and plants that can thrive in the changes in our climate and environment?
Can I answer this for the ocean? Not for the ocean. On behalf of the ocean, I would like to answer this question. So this is actually an interesting topic for me in particular because the ecosystems I study, like coral reefs, are so detrimentally impacted that a lot of us have turned to looking towards species that are still able to fulfill that functional role in the ecosystem that may not be as impacted. And sponges are one of those. Very few people appreciate sponges. But they're actually these incredible organisms that grow to be very large. They have this really complex structure. And so they provide sort of a similar ecological function that some coral reefs have in terms of providing habitat. Although it should be noted, they do not last for thousands of years like coral reefs do. So they're a little bit more ephemeral, if you will. Alternatively, anything that lives in the ocean that's a plant is going to do great because CO2, of course, is loved by all plants. And in the ocean, most organisms that are plants are actually CO2 limited. And so increasing the CO2 has been shown to increase seagrasses and kelp forests, algae and plants in general. do better under higher CO2 conditions. Although I will say, like, don't go running wild with this and say, no problem, everything's going to be fine, because although they do overall do better, they're more productive because they don't have to, they're not limited by the CO2. They do have some impacts of temperature. And so if you see an increase in CO2 alongside with temperature, like kelp forests, for example, really don't tolerate anything above 20 degrees Celsius. So once you get above that threshold, they're going to die off. So even though we are seeing some benefits to the plants, particularly the temperature increases may end up sort of counteracting that. But there will definitely be some winners and losers in the climate change scenarios.
Thank you, Amber.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have any insight on how these animals, plants are thriving, or how they can survive in a changing environment?
John, do you want to talk about the parrots?
Yeah, well, I mean, right, this is another one that's sort of debatable whether it's, you know, climate change related, but there may be an influence. The local parrots around here that maybe you've seen and heard, and maybe you love them or maybe you hate them, they ultimately come from Mexico, and they were brought here as pets, basically, and then they escaped and found each other in flocks and started breeding in Los Angeles. And we've studied their habitat needs, and it seems like they're pretty different from their home environment in Mexico, which is much warmer and there's much more rain. But, you know, it could be that the climate influence making things a little bit warmer and a little bit different here in Los Angeles has helped them. But kind of the main takeaway story there, it's probably because of the continuing introductions of parrots through the years that they just kind of finally stuck one time. It seems that when birds get introduced to a new place, it's mostly related to just the number of times they get released into that spot more than it is about any sort of climate matching.
One of the things that really, and I've written to the LA Times and I've seen articles, and the most recent article is about, well, this is about a corridor animal pass over the 101 to help like the apex predator, but also other animals will use it. They have $18 million and they need 80 million. And I'm just thinking, they've been talking about this, and I'm talking about the city and politics of it, but I think that would save animals, right? Why doesn't that move forward? How can we get that moving forward?
I think that is moving forward, right? The overpass over the 101. Amanda might know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, moving forward very slowly. You know, there's opportunities also with the revitalization of the LA River. Should they, you know, take that in the right direction? Obviously, there's many different directions you could take that revitalization. What you're focusing on. Are you focusing on businesses? Are you focusing on communities in the, you know, along the LA River? Are you focusing on wildlife? And it's gonna be a matter of finding a balance between those things. But I think there are opportunities there as well to create those corridors.
I think those things are being decided down by where I live, near Cypress Park, where they're.
Yeah.
So
but
I don't know if it's going to be all good. It doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this brings up a really good opportunity to talk about something that we haven't really talked about at all tonight, which is climate change, especially within cities, is really a diversity issue, in that it is mostly communities of color that are going to experience the worst effects of climate change. And so, you know, as scientists, we need a vast diversity of people involved in studying the impacts of climate change for it to really be successful for us to make a difference. So I just sort of wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, and let me just pick up on that and give just yet one more plug for Northeast Trees. Organizations like that are really grassroots organizations. They arise from the community and grow up. And for instance, Northeast Trees is staffed by, school kids planting seeds and then growing the seeds up into a stage where they can be planted out. And then those same kids can plant the plants and watch them grow and ultimately maybe harvest seeds from that same plant. So they're involved in the whole life cycle and they own that plant and they own the field that they're restoring. So it's organizations like that I realize there are not very many of them, but there could be a lot more. And there are more. You see them in various parts of the city. There's tree people further west. It does the same kind of thing. And so that meets a community need as well as just bringing in the organisms that are going to soak up more CO2. But both of those things are good.
And I think I think this is another really excellent opportunity to talk about that bridge between the sciences and the artists, and what artists bring to the table. And all of this discussion is that that you all artists see those connections between the science, between the wildlife, nature, and society. And it's those ties and those stories that really get people interested in science and wanting to be involved and learn about it. If we just got up here and we sat here and we talked about, listed off a bunch of facts about nature, everyone would log off. They would get bored. They wouldn't remember, how was I supposed to remember this detail about the bobcat versus the mountain lion or something like that? It's those stories that artists can sort of bring together and illustrate that draws people in. So I'm really excited about this opportunity for the collaboration, because I think that's where you get more communities involved and participating in how we address climate change.
Thank you, Amber. I remember how supportive you were when I did the Megafauna show, and you actually got me going to Africa in some ways when I talked to you about the Lewa Conservancy and going on a safari. Probably that was my most memorable experience of seeing animals in my life, and I will go back there as soon as we can again. But you all came and supported that. We did some fundraising with students, and it was really great to see the students. They made their own T-shirts, they sold them, they sold their prints, and we gave money to Big Life and to Lewa to help in Kenya. We should do more of that. Right. So
amazing. And I'll do just a quick shout out to my mom, who I know is in the audience, because she's the one who inspired all of that. So she's actually the one who gets the credit for that. Thanks, Judy.
And I talked to Judy several times about the experience. So Summer, Amanda, do you think do you think we've covered everything that we should have covered? Are we ready to sign off, or thank everybody, our audience?
Well, I was just interested in asking real quick. We've talked a lot about how climate change and changes in environment and habitats affect wildlife and animals, but we haven't really talked about how it affects us as people. And Amanda brought up, I'm really glad that she brought up, urbanization and less green spaces and how that really affects communities of color. And so I'm wondering if anyone has any insight on what we can do to help each other.
Do you want me to answer that? I feel like I'm picking up all the time. So one of the reasons for this is, there's so much here. There's so much to unpack, and we definitely can't get this covered in the amount of time that we have left with this, right? But as biologists, or urban ecologists, there's this well-known idea of something called the luxury effect, where communities that have more wealth have more biodiversity because you have more money taking care of green spaces, more green spaces being put in those areas. You have more watering of habitats, less of more properties that are owned, and therefore people are investing in putting trees there as opposed to apartment buildings, right? And so that then trickles down to the biodiversity that's there, and that affects the people that live in those communities because they don't have those green spaces to help buffer from climate change. Tree canopy, for one, is not only does it take the CO2, right, but it also reduces heat because it keeps the sun from hitting the surface of the streets, right? And so investing in building green spaces in communities that have not had those opportunities in the past is incredibly important. But more important than that is working with those communities and finding out what each community wants. What kind of a green space do they want? Do they need access to, rather than it being sort of prescribed from up above, somebody telling communities what they need.
Good point.
Can
There's
I
lots of
build on
work.
that?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I just think that there's
just
lots of work to be done for other people.
wanted to also make everybody, whenever you travel, I want you all to think about whenever you go on tropical vacations, where you go and how you spend your time, because many of the island nations that you go to visit for those beautiful beaches and amazing coral reefs that you want to go check out are solely dependent on the reef for their resources, things like their proteins and their foods. And so when people travel to countries and sort of use it and abuse it, it's a really, really difficult situation for the locals, who are obviously benefiting from tourism, but also are seeing their resources destroyed in that. So I just want to, encourage everyone when they travel to really consider their impacts of their travel and how they do that and how they interact with the community and how they use and access resources, the natural resources in those areas, because unfortunately it is the small island nations that are feeling the effects of climate change, particularly sea level rise, the most, and will be the ones that are displaced first. So as privileged US citizens or people living in a country that is, we have other options for moving and places that we can go. I just want you to be aware of that.
I've never been to Hawaii. I don't know if I'll ever get there now.
Well, at least Hawaii is a volcanic island, and so it's constantly growing. So even as sea level rise, it's getting a little bit bigger all the time. But yeah, that is not the same for all islands.
Going into our local mountains and our natural habitats in and around California, I think, is just a wonderful way to get out and not really make a massive footprint on the planet, you know. But everything that's been said about that, the Americans are the worst. We consume more than any other nation in ways that we don't have to. We're going to have to change.
Yeah, I think there's, I'm not sure if this is accurate still after COVID, but I know that the average carbon tonnage that we produce per person in the US and Australia is about 16 tons per year, where in China it's 6.86, which is a very, very high scale. And most of these smaller countries, it's less than 0.1. So we should just be aware that we are huge emitters because of our consumption of goods and products here in the US. So maybe if you're feeling intimidated about things that you can do to change, it's a global problem. And so sometimes it's really intimidating to think about how we can change things. And I think reminding yourself that every action that you take to lower your consumption overall like Gretchen was saying, driving, doing as little as you can, where you can, is always good to keep in mind.
Okay.
Amazing. Thank you all for sharing. We don't have any more questions, so I'd like to bring our director, Melinda, back up so she can say thank you.
Okay.
Great. And before she comes on, thank you, Summer.
Yes.
No, it was great. It was a
Yes.
wonderful, great question to end with. So thank you for that.
Asher and Summer both have been
Yeah,
with us
sorry,
for days.
Asher, I don't see you.
Days helping us.
It's all you guys. You did it all.
No, you did. No, and thank my panelists. I owe you if you need anything from my
Nah, we're just giving back, Linda. We're just giving back.
So maybe Melinda's not coming back.
No, I'm right here, Linda.
Oh, it's all you.
No, it's all us actually. But
Yes.
so I just, first of all, thank you to you, Linda. Actually, you're a wonderful moderator, and I just think that this had a very relaxed, charming feel because you're all colleagues. So it's just great to see that. And then I also wanted to invite everybody to our World on Fire sidewalk screening, which is April 30th at 8:30 p.m. on the sidewalk in front of Center for the Arts Eagle Rock. Because we're closed due to COVID-19, we needed to figure out a way that everybody could see the exhibition. So Pete Metzger, who is an amazing talent, and I want to thank Candace Metzger for our board co-chair, and Linda Allen for bringing Pete into the Center for the Arts Eagle Rock orbit. And so he's done these amazing projections, and I encourage everybody to come and see them. Also, we're going to be sending out a resource email after this with links of organizations, the organizations that our panelists have talked about. If you are interested in learning more about Center for the Arts Eagle Rock, you can go to our website, which is cfaer.org. This has been so informative, and just, on behalf of everybody in the Center for the Arts Eagle Rock family, we're just really grateful that we could spend this time with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
And by
you
the
for
way,
having us.
the